When the world is just too much, turn it off and turn on positive, encouraging K-Love.
I'm gonna praise.
World off. K-Love on.
K-Love is sunshine for my soul.
I love K-Love.
Listen now on your radio, online, or on the free K-Love app.
K-Love makes me feel so good.
Positive, encouraging K-Love.
Thank you for listening to the History of the Papacy and Agora Podcast Network member. We are on Facebook and Twitter. You can find both by searching for A2Z History page. You can also always send me an email to my email address, steve@a2zhistorypage.com. If you have questions, comments, concerns, or show ideas, I'd love to hear them. I especially want to hear your questions about church music and church art. Send in those great questions for the upcoming questions, answers, and comments episode. Today I have a quick favor to ask, though. If you have a moment, I've included a link in the show notes to a short poll the Agora Podcast Network doing is to help us get to know you, the audience, a little bit better. The poll is quite short, and it will really help us out, so I really would appreciate if you followed that link and completed the short poll. For today, a new powerful force is entering the history of the papacy and Christian Church in the early 7th century. Islam will make an impact on every facet of Christianity for centuries to come. The early 7th century is when Islam and the Arab armies hit the scene, and everything will be different afterwards. I thought it would be a good idea to do an episode with some of the background and context of the Arabs and where the idea of Islam came from. We've been doing these quick context episodes along the way. I've really enjoyed doing them, and I hope that they will help build background for upcoming and even for past episodes. In order to help us develop this background and context for the rise of Islam, I've brought in a scholar on the Ottoman Empire and Islam, Professor Scott Rank of the History Unplugged podcast. You may know him from the great podcasts, his own great podcast, or collaborations I've done with him on Beyond the Big Screen and other places. Scott is by trade a professor who specializes in Ottoman history. He also has a wealth of knowledge and has taught classes on the development of Islam. I know I learned a great deal by talking to Scott on this really great topic. I hope that you enjoy, and I will definitely talk to you next time, and enjoy this episode. All right, so today we have Professor Scott Rank of many podcasts, but right now he has the History Unplugged podcast, which is a great show. Today we're talking with Scott about a subject that's near and dear to him, which is the study of Islam. And now, obviously in the history of the papacy, we're talking more about Christianity. But as we've done in previous episodes, we want to look at some of the big players who the popes of Rome and the Christian Church interacted with, and Islam is obviously one of the big ones. Now, before we get into the story of Islam and where Islam developed from, Scott, what is your area of study?
Yeah, so my background is connected to Islam. It's on the history of the Ottoman Empire. Specifically in the modern period, and the cutoff from modern period, Ottomanists will typically use either 1839 or 1876 because there were a bunch of reforms that were happening then. And I look at relations between Christians and Muslims. And so I didn't directly study the foundation of Islam, but to study any Middle Eastern civilization, you have to get into that. And I was looking at Christian and Muslim writers who were arguing against each other and trying to disprove the other religion. And they both dug in a lot into the early history of Islam. And Christians would argue, well, the establishment of Islam, it has problems from the beginning that Christianity doesn't have, so that's why it's not the best. And then Muslims would argue, well, the prophet did this and this and this, so this shows that Muhammad is the final prophet, so our religion is the best. So there's a lot to untangle here, and people have been trying to untangle it for a very long time.
What got you interested in Islam and the Middle East as a young budding scholar? What made you drawn towards that area?
You know, I don't have a sophisticated answer to this. My answer was, I was on a study abroad in Turkey my sophomore year of college. I knew absolutely nothing about Turkey. I thought they speak Arabic, right? Well, they don't. They speak Turkish, but I wanted to do one. I had friends who went there, and they thought it was cool. So I thought, all right, sure, why not? I have nothing better to do for a semester. And I was just blown away. I'm from Iowa. We have cultivated cornfields that are 120 years old. And unless you get into American Indian archaeology, you're not going to see anything very old there. But Istanbul, you can walk up to the Theodosian city walls that were built in 440 AD to try to block off Attila the Hun's invasion. And there were things that just I thought were funny, and people living there didn't think much of it, but you would have a mosque, but then many of the mosques were funded and built by the government, and they would lease out the minarets to have cell phone towers on them. So in my mind, I think, oh, that's ancient and modern mixed together. But for a Turkish person, they think, well, yeah, it's just part of the background of life. So it made me see things that probably were all around me in America, but it made me see it with kind of fresh eyes. And yeah, so I got into Turkey and then came there after college and studied the history of it. And that's how it all began.
All right. That's really cool. Now, just so we all kind of get on the same page, what is modern Islam, and maybe what are some of the basic tenets of the religion?
Well, the thing that you'll always see in, if you're taking a college survey class on Islam or the beginnings, you'll find that, okay, the holy book is the Quran. It was the message given from God, or Allah, which is just God in Arabic, to the final prophet, Muhammad. And they'll typically give the 5 pillars. They'll say it's the Shahada, faith, which is, it's a statement that you say there is no God but God, and Muhammad is his prophet, and the calls of prayer in the Muslim world, this will be mentioned in there. That's one thing. So Islam 101, you say that. Number 2 is Salah, or prayer, the 5 prayers a day. And there's a certain formation that you go through. You can pray in a mosque. You can pray in your home. Third is Zakat, or charity. It's a amount of your income, about 1/40th or so of revenue generated if you can afford it. If you can't, then there's exceptions. The last is fasting, called Saum in Arabic, and any Arabic speakers out there will hear I'm butchering the accent, so there you go. But I mispronounce things in many languages on my podcast, with all of you can hear. So you're supposed to do it during the month of Ramadan, and the Islamic calendar has its own month system. It's based on the lunar calendar, does not match up to the Gregorian, so every year Ramadan is pushed about 11 days back. So right now I think it's in the summer. I'm not sure, but
yeah, I think early May-ish, somewhere in there, I think.
Okay. Yeah, so it's brutal in the summer, and in the winter it's easier because you cannot eat or drink sunrise to sunset. And then the last is Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca, which if you have the means as a Muslim, you undertake. Now, these 5 things, when I taught a class on Islam at the University of Kansas, what I told my students was, in a way, this is kind of like the 7 deadly sins in medieval Christianity. The 7 deadly sins, you don't see the phrase 7 deadly sins in the Bible. It's just it's a nice little shorthand that theologians and priests came up with to encapsulate a lot of doctrine to people who weren't very doctrinally sophisticated. Now, those 5 things I just mentioned, those are all in the Quran, and you can find verses or ayats to substantiate each one of them, but there's no phrase, 5 pillars of Islam, you find in the Quran. That comes later, with later scholars and later traditions in Islam. And there are some historians, like Richard Bulliet, who's written all sorts of really important books, who thinks that the 5 pillars isn't all that important because they weren't universally practiced the same way. If you're in Central Asia in 1100, and are you going to Mecca for the pilgrimage? No. I mean, unless you're a wealthy noble, you can't go that way. That's way too far. No one can afford that. or prayer 5 times a day. Yeah, and that one's much more standard, but it changes. I mean, there were some Central Asian Muslims, a folk tradition would say you can go to this city in what's now modern-day Kazakhstan twice instead of going to Mecca to fulfill your pilgrimage duty. So the duties that you perform are practiced differently around the world. And now, if you go on a pilgrimage, it's like Disney World. You fly in, you are there for a few days, and you fly out, compared to spending months on camelback or ship, and you could potentially die. So just so much easier. Kind of like going to to the Papacy, or going to the St. Peter's Basilica for a blessing from the Pope. Man, that's so much easier now than a few hundred years ago. Just religion is so much easier.
It sure is. Now, to look at Islam, and I guess I like to look at anything before we dig into some of the other issues, what's the standard story of the foundation of Islam? Like, what do Muslims believe?
Okay, yeah. So, yeah, I'll give that spiel, and but before I say this, what I should mention is, no, actually, I'm not going to get in. Sorry, I'm doing like the history nerd thing where you don't just tell people the information, you have to contextualize it before you even say it is. Okay, sorry about that. Let me start. I'll give the background, and then I'll mention my asterisk. Okay, the standard story is that there have been many prophets who have preached monotheism. Many of the people that you would see in the Old Testament are also figures within Islam and mentioned in the Quran and traditions within Islam. So you would, for example, you would hear a story about how Abraham and Ishmael journeyed to the Hijaz, the area of Mecca and Medina, and established the Kaaba as a site of worship, and Abraham preached monotheism. Ishmael was his son by his concubine Hagar. Ishmael is the figure that then, from the Old Testament account, he is in Arabia, and his story continues on in Islam's story. With Muhammad, he receives his first prophetic revelation at the age of 40. He receives it from the angel Gabriel. The prophetic revelations that he receives are parts of the Quran. This is his message. This is his preaching. He preaches it to his early followers. And then within the story of early Islamic history, there are chains of transmission that are claimed where this person heard this from this person, from this person, from this person, from this person back to Muhammad. So there's this paper trail that many argue this proves that the teaching we have is reliable, so we know that what came from Muhammad's mouth is what we have today. So he preaches for a while. He and his followers eventually leave the city of Mecca, which is in modern-day Saudi Arabia. It was a city full of traders. They were polytheistic in nature, worshiped many gods, similar to other sites you would see in the ancient world. Another religious example is Paul in the city of Athens or in the city of Ephesus. He gets into trouble with the townspeople there. They kick him out. He has to flee. That's the beginning of the Muslim calendar. They go to Medina, where Muhammad is giving a role as, he has a jurisprudential role, where Muhammad offers edicts in a King Solomon sort of way, where he is an arbitrator of different disputes. So he is a mediator, he has a political role here, a judicial role, and a religious role. So the way that in Islam you might not have a separation of mosque and state can in many ways be traced back to the founder, where Muhammad embodies many of the different offices in one. He's a military leader, he is a political leader, a judicial leader. Many phrases in the Quran have to do with judicial matters and how you arbitrate different disputes. So, to make a very, very, very long story short, he gathers followers, gathers an army, wins many military victories. In his lifetime, essentially conquers the Arabian Peninsula. Afterwards, there's a whole dispute about who succeeds him. His successor is the Caliph or Khalif. There are 4 of them. When Islam is sort of united as one body, before then you have dynasties that essentially control the caliphate, the organization of Islam. The conquests are absolutely stupendous after that. In a few decades, Syria and Palestine are conquered, some of the richest provinces of Byzantium. Egypt is conquered. The entire Sassanid Empire is completely conquered in the mid-600s. Then all of North Africa. The Caliphate enters Spain in 711 and goes all the way up to France by 732 and is checked at the Battle of Tours. So something I'll just mention with that story is many of the early histories about Islam and the challenges we have, and this kind of sets the stage for the rest of our discussion, it's not as if Muhammad writes a biography about his life. The Quran has very little biographical there's no biographical information of Muhammad's life. There's only about 2 geographic places named. It's moral advice, it's pronouncements. It would read like an Old Testament book in a lot of ways, like a minor prophet, where it seems kind of floating out in space and time. Now, later on, when you do get biographies of Muhammad, like Ibn Ishaq's, that's written in the 8th century. Many of the, I'm forgetting the term right now. What is it? Where you have sayings of the prophets.
Hadith.
Thank you. Wow. Okay. Hadiths. Those are the major collections are, again, a couple of centuries after Muhammad's death. So, and when biographies of Muhammad's life are written, this is when Islam is not an upstart movement at the periphery of civilization of Byzantium and Persia, because Arabia is the backwater of backwaters. I cannot stress that enough. But the story of Muhammad's life isn't written in this time. It's written when Islam is a world empire, when places in Iran and Iraq are some of the wealthiest, most intellectually advanced places on earth. So now a lot of historians are coming back around and trying to analyze the early histories of Islam from this perspective, that it could be these people trying to grapple the terms with, how did all of this happen? And I don't doubt these early writers' sincerity. I'm not saying they were trying to pull a con job, but so of course they would impute things to the agency of God. So that's where critical historians are trying to think, these aren't written at the early years of Islam. These are written 200 years later. So these writers could be projecting back things that are happening in 800 or 900 back into the 600s. So these are the challenges we have with anything in early Islam.
Putting in the context, like you were saying, this is a small group in central Saudi Arabia, like really in the middle of nowhere, but close to several big empires. How did this group explode out so quickly and basically conquer entire Persia and most of the Roman Empire within like 70 years? Like, what are the big theories on that?
Yeah, so I mean, if you ask a Muslim, they'll have a religious explanation, which makes sense. The traditional Western look, if you look at Orientalist scholars, and I don't mean in the derogatory Edward Said term, I just mean that was the classical term of people who studied the Middle East 100 years ago. They would say that Muhammad was, in many ways, like Genghis Khan. He was able to find a society that was torn apart by warfare among different tribes, to overcome those divisions, to be a successful arbiter between them, and channel all of that energy in Arabia outwards. So there were wealthy opportunities for plundering raids. There were many opportunities to harness all of this energy that had been wasted squabbling amongst themselves in Arabia. More recently, historians would look at methods of warfare that you have highly mobile itinerant groups that can do quick strikes, kind of like Vikings, where a Viking can go on their longship, and if they see a target that they can't defeat, they can just go back into the desert. But if they see a unguarded village or town, then they can come in a raid. And those in Arabia could do the same with fortresses or garrisons or towns in Byzantium or Sassania. But another factor, too, is that there had been a brutal 3 decades long war between Byzantium and Persia from the early 600s to the 630s, where they were completely depleted. They were exhausted. They had worn each other out. Many thousands and thousands of soldiers had been slaughtered. And in the 6th century, there had been a terrible plague that recent studies have argued that could have been as bad as the Black Plague, where a sizable percentage of the Byzantine Empire and probably Persia was wiped out by bubonic plague. So you have two empires that are still recovering. They've come off a terrible war. It could have been a factor where some of these nomadic groups could have simply gone to a town and found it unguarded. So they may not have conquered as much as walked in and taken over new ownership. And then another factor, too, is traditionally it was imagined that everyone within the armies of Islam were from Mecca or Medina or from the Arabian Peninsula. Well, they couldn't all have been, because the Arabian Peninsula, a lot of it doesn't support that much life. And there's parts of it near Yemen which can support agriculture, but Mecca was a city of trade because you had to trade because not much would grow there. So you were dependent on trade to feed people. You constantly had to have caravans moving around. Much of the military muscle, which we might talk about later, were Arabic tribes to the north, like the Ghassanids and Lakhmids. Linguistically and ethnically Arab people. The Ghassanids were mostly Christian at this time, very much in the orbit of Byzantium. They would be in Mesopotamia, in Iraq. And these could have been probably really formed a lot of the muscle of the early Muslim armies too, but they seem to be left out of the story a lot. So that's something else that historians are looking at.
Do they know what brand of Christianity the Ghassanids were?
Yeah, so what makes a lot of people in Arabia good candidates for conversion to Islam is that they were not Chalcedonian Christian. They were monophysite. And I don't know if in your show you've gotten into all the Christological differences with these groups. It gets very messy. But anyway, all that to say, they had a different understanding of the nature of Christ, and different councils in the Byzantine Empire had excommunicated them. So that's a big factor that a lot of historians think made much of the Middle East ripe for, if not conversion to Islam, there were many Christians who were happy to live under a new Muslim government instead of Byzantium. If you were a Coptic Christian, or if you were a monophysite, if you were Syrian Orthodox, and the ecumenical patriarch in Constantinople excommunicated you or said that your beliefs were a heresy, and then someone else comes along who has an alternate government and they say, okay, we believe something that sounds, from your perspective, a little bit weird, but we won't persecute you. We'll let you worship as you want. You have to pay a tax to us. And you might think, all right, that's probably less than what I pay to Byzantium anyway. Psh, sure, why not? I'll fight for you. And then there's a whole debate, too, about what exactly early Islam was. There's a book called Muhammad and the Believers by Fred Donner, probably one of the premier historians. I think he's at the University of Chicago on early Islam. He argues that the term mu'min, which is just the Arabic plural for believer, so the followers of Islam were called believers, and that's still a phrase that's used, that what he argues is the narrative about Muhammad that comes 200 years later isn't what he was preaching. He very well could have just been preaching a monotheistic renewal movement that incorporated Jews and Christians as well, or just a general run-of-the-mill monotheist. And it might not have been until about a century or two later until the differences in Islam are fully articulated to make it distinctly separate from Islam and Christianity. So if you were an Arab Christian who was a monophysite called a heretic by Istanbul or in Constantinople, and there's this new religious movement coming out of Arabia that maybe it's Christian, maybe it's not, I don't know, but they treat me fine, so whatever, then it might not have been so unpalatable to join the cause and get your sword.
When the world is just too much, turn it off and turn on positive, encouraging K-Love.
I'm gonna praise.
World off. K-Love on.
K-Love is sunshine for my soul.
I love K-Love.
Listen now on your radio, online, or on the free K-Love app.
K-Love makes me feel so good.
Positive, encouraging K-Love.
AI can help you write, research, and solve problems faster than ever before. But there is a problem. Most AI is built on a worldview that does not reflect biblical truth. That's why Dominion Chat exists. Dominion brings the power of AI under the lordship of Christ. All the benefits of modern AI built on a biblical worldview foundation. Your work matters, but so does your soul. Sign up today at dominion.chat.
You've laid out some of the things of what modern scholars believe is true about the standard story. Do they believe that there was a historical Muhammad? Is that a debatable issue?
Yeah, I mean, that's on very strong basis. It's sort of the same with in scholarship of early Christianity. Regardless on one's private religious views, there aren't that many people who think that Jesus didn't exist. That's, I would say, a fringe view. The same is with Muhammad. Some of the earliest accounts we have of him come from Byzantine chroniclers that I think are only writing a couple of years after his death. And I forget which chronicler. He may not have even been aware that Muhammad died, but he refers to this movement that's led by Muhammad, king of the Arabs. And they don't call him a religious leader. They don't say that he is leading a new religious movement. They just call him king of the Arabs. So we have a lot of different sources like that, from Byzantine sources, Egyptian sources, and others that at least attest to his life. And so I think that's something that is on very, very firm footing. And there aren't that many people who question whether he lived or not.
In that earliest time, so there's Byzantine sources that attest to a historical Muhammad. What else were they saying about him? I take it they probably didn't have a very high opinion of him.
Well, there's we don't know, because they're trying to. I think they're dealing more with the movement itself. So there's really not that much information. It's just that there is a movement. They know that it's attributed to Muhammad himself. And again, because we have the issue where Muslims themselves aren't producing many sources, then one of the earliest accounts we do have is on the Dome of the Rock, the mosque that was built there. There is an inscription that has part of the Quran there, and it does mention Muhammad as well. So some of the writings are like Thomas the Presbyter, who writes in 640, or there is a Coptic writing. So Pope Martin I mentions him in 655. So the accounts of him, one person, John of Damascus, who was an administrator, or maybe his father was, in Damascus as a Byzantine, he saw the city being taken over by Muslims. He writes one of the first, it's a polemic against Islam, but he refers to it as Hagarism. So the followers of Hagar, which was the mother of Ishmael. So he's not even fully articulating Islam. He calls it a heresy the way that somebody today might call, I don't know, a Jehovah's Witness a heresy, who has theological differences with it. But to an outsider, they might not understand, wait, isn't Jehovah's Witness Christian? I mean, wait, what? So an outsider might even clearly see a distinction with Islam and Christianity. But and I think John of Damascus is writing sometime in the 650s, who he lays out Islam. He's pretty confused by it. He thinks that Muslims worship the Greek goddess Aphrodite. So maybe that came from Muslims themselves, who still had some lingering Arabian paganism in them and hadn't quite figured things out. Kind of like your Viking who converts to Christianity, and he has a cross on the front of his grave, but then he has Thor's hammer on the back of it, and he's still not quite sure. So maybe that's what he was up against. But yeah, it was a time of confusion.
We'll skip to there's a lot of interesting talk about the influences of Islam from different religions. But before we go into that, maybe let's just talk a little bit. We've said where some of the places that the scholars believe there is a basis to the standard narrative. Where are maybe the scholars questioning some of the ideas of the standard narrative, or maybe there's a little bit more complexity to the historical context than what the standard telling might say?
Yeah, it's really tricky. Right now, there's the place where scholarship is on Islam in some ways, it's about 2 centuries behind Christian scholarship. And what I mean by that is the textual criticism of the Bible, or trying to historically deconstruct and reconstruct Christianity, is something that goes back to the Enlightenment. You have works in the 1700s, and it really picks up steam in the 1800s. That's only really beginning in the last generation or two with Islam. So there is a book called, I think it's Hagarism, I'm not sure, that came out in the 1970s by Michael Cook and Patricia Crone, or there's the Fred Donner book I mentioned earlier. One argument that's interesting is that they'll say a lot of the early biographies that we have about Muhammad, or the hadiths that will tell us about his life, sometimes these get very, very detailed. We have hadiths that will talk about what Muhammad looked like. That's why you have Muslim traditions where men dress in a certain way and would have beards because they think that's what the Prophet looked like. They'll talk about how Muhammad acted around children, how he behaved toward different animals. So some people think cats are better than dogs because Muhammad didn't think ablution water was dirtied by a cat drinking from it. So all of these details, some scholars wonder if there was an attempt to sort of reverse engineer the Quran, and if there are moral pronouncements about something, such as make sure that you take care of orphans, they would think, oh, there's talk here about orphans. That must mean Muhammad was an orphan. And sure enough, in the early accounts we have of his life, he is orphaned at an early age, adopted by his uncle. Other factors, too, where the tradition says he received his revelation when he was 40 years old. That's considered an age when you've really come into full maturity and adulthood, so it's very convenient that he would receive it at that age. It's sort of like studies in England in the 1800s on Shakespeare, where if they didn't know something autobiographical about Shakespeare, some writers would look into the different plays and think, well, Shakespeare writes a lot about this topic, so that must mean that was part of his life. Oh, his love life, we can look at it by looking at Romeo and Juliet, whatever. Maybe he was spurned by someone else due to forbidden love. And some historians think that there's a similar thing with the early biographies in Islam, that they're trying to reverse engineer these works to explain it. And with other scholars thinking that, maybe Islam wasn't a movement that was, it could have been sort of this muddled monotheism for the first century. By the time you have these biographies being written in the early accounts of Islam, when Islam is a great global power and its theology is fully articulated away from Christianity and Islam, then they're really trying to sand off the rough edges of the early figures of Muhammad and his companions and other people as well, and really trying to clean it up a lot and sand off all those rough edges. So there's just a lot of debate. And there's one fascinating book called A Syro-Aramaic Reading of the Quran, where one scholar argues that parts of the Quran that don't make a lot of sense in Arabic make a whole heck of a lot more sense if you interpret it through the Syriac language. And wondering if the Quran itself might have, parts of it could have originally been written in Syriac, which is totally blasphemous to a Muslim if you think that the Quran was revealed from Allah in Arabic and it is his language that he gave down. That would not jive with Orthodox Islam. So the scholarship is not really happening in the Muslim world at all. Not really that many places I could say where you could practice this. I mean, almost all of it's happening in Western universities. That's a good
chance to pivot a little bit into the influences of early Islam. I had read about that, the Syro-Aramaic or something reading of the Quran. I can't remember the guy's name is, I think it's a pseudonym, but Christoph.
Yeah, it's Christoph yeah.
Now, he's saying that it's based on a Christian lectionary or something, but I've read other books that are pointing more towards influences of Judaism and Arab, like a proto-Arab monotheism that was kind of bubbling up at around the 5th, 6th century. What's maybe more of the consensus on what were those earliest influences on Islam, and of what maybe what was Muhammad hearing about in his time?
Yeah, that's a good question. And anyone out there who really wants to dive into this, a great intro book that you'll probably find on any college survey on Islam is a Jonathan Berkey book called, I think it's The Formation of Islam, 600 to 1800. His whole point is that when Islam comes onto the world scene, it's not the breakdown of the Roman Empire or whatever. It actually is just the next step. It's probably one of the torchbearers of Roman civilization and fully part of the medieval world. And many of the imperial and social traditions of the Near East are carried on by Islam. So it's not this radical rupture. And so I mentioned that as kind of to answer your question. There's a lot of things happening that Islam is influenced by. You mentioned that there's monotheism bubbling up. Judaism is quite well represented in Arabia at this time through the Arabian Peninsula. So that the preaching of monotheism there. Christianity, a lot of the debates in Byzantium are on iconoclasm. Do we revere icons or do we smash them? Some people have looked at the Quran as, in a way, it's not too different from a lot of the Gnostic Gospels that were around, like the Gospel of Barnabas. They would say the Quran just happens to be a Gnostic Gospel followed by 1.6 billion people, but it has a lot of the same things where you do not depict God in human form. Many of those words could have been written by an iconoclast, somebody who was really opposed to the theology of Constantinople and didn't like what was happening there. Arab monotheism, like you mentioned, there were monotheists are mentioned in Arabia that Muhammad has preached to, and we don't know as much about these groups of people, Hanafis. The Muslim tradition has said that these are like the faithful remnants left over from when Abraham went to Arabia and preached there. And in the sense as if the Arabs are a blessed nation the way that the Jewish people are. They could have been influenced by their neighbors as well. Zoroastrianism isn't really as prevalent. The only places where you really see it are there's some different Persian trading colonies on the Arabian Peninsula. And then that's where you would see Zoroastrianism. It's sort of an expatriate thing. But one point, too, here is that the one narrative of early Islam is that Arabic culture was barbaric and cruel, and girls, if they were born, would be buried alive if a family thought that they had too many girls and not enough sons. And there's this barbarity and cruelty and violence and murder. And I'm sure that's the case. I mean, in the pre-modern world, that's just how a lot of life is. But in a way, it's almost as if it's the Islamic history itself is kicking down Arabia. But there's been a lot of archaeological research that's found, I would say, a more robust Arabian Peninsula than we've given it credit for. Because you have shipping traffic going in the different places, the Persian Gulf, the Red Sea, going around Arabia up to the Indian Ocean. There's a whole Indian economy that's existed since the ancient world. There are robust trade routes. The Nabateans were an ethnically Arab civilization. They built Petra in Jordan, where Indiana Jones in The Last Crusade is. Huge trade empire, very interesting. So what we're seeing archaeologically is that there was more robustness and in Arabia than I think we realized. It wasn't as if they were these desert dwellers and they received a revelation and they just enter the world scene. So it makes sense that as a crossroads of these different trade routes that they could be influenced by a lot of different ideas and religions.
When the world is just too much, turn it off and turn on positive, encouraging K-Love.
I'm gonna praise.
World off. K-Love on.
K-Love is sunshine for my soul.
I love K-Love.
Listen now on your radio, online, or on the free K-Love app.
K-Love makes me feel so good.
Positive, encouraging K-Love.
AI can help you write, research, and solve problems faster than ever before. But there is a problem. Most AI is built on a worldview that does not reflect biblical truth. That's why Dominion Chat exists. Dominion brings the power of AI under the lordship of Christ. All the benefits of modern AI built on a biblical worldview foundation. Your work matters. but so does your soul. Sign up today at dominion.chat.
Maybe it's interesting where Mecca and Medina are. They're portrayed in the early Islamic as kind of in the middle of nowhere, but they were, like you were saying, they were really plugged into a lot of different trading centers. Were they big cities? Were they tiny towns? How did they fit into geographically into the Roman Empire and like you were saying, the Asian empires? Where did they sit?
Yeah, I mean, they wouldn't have been huge by any means. The places with a higher population density, probably the biggest that you would find on the Arabian Peninsula would be down in Yemen. The Roman geographers called that Felix Arabia, or Happy Arabia, where there was enough irrigation that you could cultivate some agriculture and you could get a bigger population there. But then you have other places like the Empty Quarter in Saudi Arabia, where you're crossing it with a camel caravan, but there's simply not enough precipitation to do anything there. And I can't accurately say Mecca, Medina, how large they would be, but they would not be huge by any means. As a crossroads, just crossing the Red Sea simply, you could go to Ethiopia. That is an ancient kingdom with a robust civilization. And some early I won't say accounts, but this isn't like I would say part of the official canon of early Muslim history, but some would say that when Muhammad and his followers and others too left Mecca, some went to Ethiopia to preach the message of Islam. So there was it at least speaks, if this story was believable, there would be a connection with Ethiopia and would be seen as a great civilization and a great kingdom. Interestingly enough, there's also a story that Muhammad writes a letter to Heraclius, the Byzantine emperor, calling on him to accept Islam, and Heraclius refuses. He's sort of an interesting character in early Islam, where he's kind of this... he's like in the Crusader histories, where Saladin is seen as an enemy, but also as this noble person who is a worthy foil to Richard the Lionheart. Heraclius, I don't know if it's because... the Caliphate, it could conquer Iran, but it wasn't able to conquer Byzantium. So maybe Heraclius is kind of this worthy foe, worthy opponent. So in a way, in his own odd way, he holds up well in early Islamic history. I thought that was interesting. But yeah, lots of Mecca and Medina. They're at a crossroads a lot of places. They're not huge, but maybe it's kind of as big as you could hope for in an area that really can't support a lot of agriculture.
Maybe quickly tell us a little bit what happens in this. You sort of laid it out that Islam spread really quickly. After that initial phase of expansion, how long did that expansion phase go on for?
I mean, the first stage is very fast. I'd have to look up some numbers, but Muhammad dies in 632. I think 634 is the Battle of Yarmouk around there, or maybe it's 636. It's when the commander of the Caliph, Khalid ibn al-Walid, which I would rank as one of the best military strategic minds in history, and essentially conquers the Near East. So Syria, Palestine, that area. I think about a decade later, Egypt is conquered. At this time, you have navies, and people hear that and think, wait, where did navies come from? Hey, Coptic Christians, they're happy to join the cause, and they have experience as navalmen, so that adds new resources to the growth of the caliphate. In a way, it's kind of a multiplier effect where it's not just this, ragtag group of Arabs who are fighting all these battles. Nothing succeeds like success, so other people are joining these armies. And there's conquest, there's also plundering opportunities, there's a great way to accrue a lot of wealth. This is what's happening here. And the Sassanid Empire falls in very short order, 630s, 640s. Then Islam pushes out in the next few centuries into Central Asia. And then you have Turkic groups by the 9th, 10th centuries are converting to Islam. I think the 12th, 13th century, you have Islam all the way down in Indonesia, Western China. And like I said earlier, it enters Spain in 711 and then all the way up to France in 732. So then there are different islands. Malta is conquered, I forget when. Then there's other places that don't really fall until much later with the Ottoman Empire. So it expands phenomenally quickly. But something that's left out of all this is some scholars say that to call it Muslim can be a misnomer, because if Egypt or Syria is conquered, for example, by no means does everyone convert to Islam. I mean, 10% of Egypt is still Christian, and the upper echelon of leadership could have been Muslim, but it's almost Muslim in the way of saying when the British colonized India, would you call India a Christian nation because its leadership was British and Christian? No. I mean, maybe the very highest leadership was, but it's the flimsiest cover for what would be just a massive amount of Christians and Jews and maybe some holdover lingering paganism here or there. So you really can't talk about a Muslim majority Middle East until probably after the Mongols, centuries later. This is a very, very, very long process from the conversion to Islam. So the initial conquests are quick, but in terms of the cultural entrenchment, that's a much longer process as well.
I think within like a half an hour, 40 minutes, we've covered a lot of history. Is there anything else that you think that people should know to maybe really understand the history of Islam and maybe have a little bit better idea of where Muslim people and Islam is coming from today that carries through to history?
Well, I think that what I started one of my classes with talking about the history of Islam is that it's connected to a world religion, definitely, and knowing the story, I think, helps really understand where the 1.6 or however many billion Muslims on earth, where they come from and what they believe. But what I just find so fascinating about the history is that it's not a violent rupture, but it's really a continuation of the development of human civilization that's already happening. And the example I gave and I started a class with was there were ruins founded, I think, in Syria a few decades ago, and the excavation team thought this has all the hallmarks of a Roman temple, the way that the pillars are set up, the architectural techniques. This is a wealthy city, so the craftsmanship is very good. Or they thought it looked like it was Byzantine, probably 5th or 6th century. It had fallen directly flat on its face, in a sense, the facade of this building. When they looked on the other side of it, they found that it was actually Muslim. It dated back, I think, to the early 8th century. So it had all the architectural hallmarks of Roman or Byzantine. However, it had an inscription in Arabic. But that was the only telltale sign that could help them understand what that was. So I think that's just a good illustration that there are important changes that do happen, but I'd like to look at some of the connection points, the continuation of what's happening with the story of civilization, and as we're moving from the classical world up to the medieval world and up to our own age.
Well, this is definitely fascinating. I think you've left a lot of different kernels and seeds for people to follow up on if they want to learn more about this. If people want to learn more about your podcast, History Unplugged, where can they find it?
Yeah, go to historyunpluggedpodcast.com. And there I cover all sorts of topics, but because I do the Ottoman Empire, I tend to default to that. And I love to use the Ottomans as a test case to see when Europeans were doing this, what were Ottomans doing, so we can see what's similar across civilizations, but then how can religion and custom affect things? So I did a long episode on prostitution, and I saw, hey, brothels are really similar in Europe and the Ottoman Empire, but Islamic law makes it different here and there. So I do a lot of A/B split testing, as we like to say in internet marketing parlance.
Well, thanks a lot. And this will definitely not be the last you'll be hearing from Scott and I on a lot of different topics. So definitely keep your podcatchers tuned in. So thanks again, Scott, and we'll be talking to you soon.
Yeah, absolutely.
is just too much. Turn it off and turn on positive, encouraging K-Love.
I'm gonna praise.
World
I
off.
praise the mighty
K-Love on.
K-Love is sunshine for my soul.
I love K-Love.
Listen now on your radio, online, or on the free K-Love app.
K-Love makes me feel so good.
Positive, encouraging K-Love.
AI can help you write, research, and solve problems faster than ever before. But there is a problem. Most AI is built on a worldview that does not reflect biblical truth. That's why Dominion Chat exists. Dominion brings the power of AI under the lordship of Christ. All the benefits of modern AI built on a biblical worldview foundation. Your work matters, but so does your soul. Sign up today at dominion.chat.